Alden is another deck that I didn't cover in my preliminary deck list video because I wasn't planning on picking it up similarly to Alcalibra, but changed my mind later and haven't regretted it since why now it's the second video I'm covering with this new kind of deck discussion format that I tried out with Alcalibra as well. So just a reminder, if you didn't see the last video, how these deck breakdowns will be discussed is first I'll be going over the deck's winning image, then I'll show the deck list. Not really spend too much time discussing it because instead I'm focusing on what this deck is trying to do, which means then we'll go into a turnover turn strategy guide, then discuss the Mulligan as well as the ride deck discard, finish off with any additional notes and strengths and weaknesses discussion to conclude it. So with that out of the way, let's get right into it. This deck's winning image, instead of it being some big explosive turn we're trying to build up to, is rather a consistent yet powerful attack pattern that we want to be going for every single turn once we are on our Alden and our opponent's Vanguard is on grade 3. This is accomplished through, of course, Alden's second skill, which when attacks lets us draw a card and then choose a card from hand, call to rear guard circle, and that called unit gets power plus 10,000 until end of turn. This synergizes very nicely with the Razianel here, as when it's called over by a unit due to Alden's effect, that call unit gains 10,000, as well as we can Soul Blast 1 to then stand another rear guard. So we could stand the booster, but also we can stand the other front row rear guard to be able to create 5 attacks in one turn, which is typically optimal. Now, as you can see, we've got some other guys on board here. So while the core of this combo can be accomplished with just these 2 cards and any other attacker in the front row, there are some more optimal cards that we would like to see. First off, for the other attacker, Teth Fault is great because it can gain 10k from her own effect, meaning that she's swinging in for 20k on her own. With a fully set up board, of course, because that's the other part. We just ideally want a fully set up board to maximize on power gain. Teth Fault is part of that. However, if we have access to call cards due to card effect, either it be through a Teth Fault effect to overcall herself, Alden's Divine Skill, or another card we have here, Ermac is ideal for this, as it gains 15k, meaning it's just a bit bigger than the Teth Fault by itself, so it can be the even bigger restand target for the Razianel effect. We also want Wedge Dragon, ideally behind Vanguard, to act as a 15k booster, and also generate a soul for the Razianel. And finally, from hand, the card we want to call off of Alden's effect on top of the Razianel is typically the Ermac because it just has the biggest power gain, and between Alden itself and the Razianel, it will gain a plus 35k, meaning it's a 45k attacker all by itself. I want to emphasize that these are the ideal pieces, but to be able to accomplish this winning image at a base, you just need a Counterblast, a Soul Blast, an attacker in the front row, and then Alden, and then the Razianel in the other column to be able to get your 5 attacks. Oh, and almost forgot the other piece for the optimal play pattern is if we can Persona Ride, we want to. We're a multi-attack deck. Multi-attack decks get even more benefit from Persona Ride than the standard 3 attack decks. So, of course we would want it. Before getting into the turnover turn part of this guide, I'm going to show the deck list up on screen. Right now, you can pause to view that if you want. These card choices help inform some of the talking points I'll be making for these next few minutes. So starting off with our turn 1 specifically going second, because that is when we are able to attack. This deck is an aggro deck, so we just want to aggress with what we've got. So that can be really any piece in hand, whether it be the Gragon, Wedge Fluence Dragon, just throw those down and attack. The only difference that I have to add to this is if we have Saragons here, because their effect only triggers when boosting. So ideally, we just want to make some columns, make them big, push damage, and then be able to tag this out for more resources. So definitely try to maximize on columns with these Saragons. But if, for say, you have 2 Saragons, but no other unit to really call down to boost with, it is perfectly acceptable to call down that second Saragon to attack with, because the situation that it creates is you're still getting in that damage, meaning we can either force a damage or a card out of the opponent's hand, which is good. And now the opponent has a choice. Well, either they have to use up one of their attacks to swing into the Saragon, which is also nice for us because now we don't have to eat one attack and potentially guard it. Or if they ignore it, you can just move it back the very next turn to boost with it and still get off its effect. Of course, this is generalization, barring whatever your opponent's on, what effects they have access to. Moving into our grade 2 turn, the focus is still very much on aggression, but we've got a new dimension to set aggression. That with the Order, Wisdom of Beginning that cleared the world, as well as Forefront Knight Teth Fault. Both these cards help us build a board without as much strain on our hand, and in fact, the Order helps us draw more cards, meaning we can help dig into more pieces or shield value, while Teth Fault is further deck thinning, and if it sticks around on board, once our opponent gets to grade 3, it becomes a 20k attacker, which is really, really strong. Now, we won't always have these cards or always have this combination of cards, so really we just want to call down any pieces we can to further put aggression on the opponent. The cards that I showed off before, Wedge Fluence, Saragon, and Groudon, of course, are all great for that as well. Saragon as well, if we have the order, means that it will always be live, so it's the ideal booster that can tag out into more pieces. But also, if we can call down enough pieces, a lot of times Saragon will be live anyway. Also, don't hesitate to call down the Air Mag for grade 2 to start swinging in as well. We'll get to why in a little bit. Moving into our grade 3 turn here, of course, we can get more board plussing with the Sodios, be able to call from top 5 for a Soul Blast, but specifically, I want to break this down into 2 scenarios, going first versus going second, because as we covered in the deck's winning image, when we are going second, we have access to the full power of the Raziel to get out 5 attacks. We also have access to Divine Skill, but going first, we don't have access to either of those. So what do? Well, we still want a Raziel because being able to overcall it with Alden's effect, we can still build up this 45k Air Mac on this turn. Raziel also on call lets us draw a card for that Energy Blast 4. We should have 6 at that point, so that is also ideal. And then from there, we just do a lot of the same things we're doing on turn 2, where if we've got Order we like to play, if we've got Death Fault, we can continue to deck. Then if we still have the Soul, we really want to try to find that Wedge Fluence Dragon here to be able to set up that Soul for Alden, since we need it for Divine Skill and Raziel once our opponent is at grade 3. But other than that, just call out pieces, start aggressing, get in those 4 attacks, and keep pushing damage. But if our opponent already is on grade 3, we do want to go for our winning image. So I've already covered that, so I'm not going to go over that again, but I'm going to go over some of the additional information for this explosive turn, because on this turn, we want to Divine Skill here. So specifically here, what we have access to is an ability to start calling stuff down in our main phase, being able to trigger effects or whatever we need to do, and then use Alden's Divine Skill to be able to look at top 7, try to dig for more pieces, and start overcalling stuff, being able to trigger effects such as Raziel's second effect to give something 10k, but also looping them back to hand. Specifically with Raziel, the reason I pulled out this example is, at this point, we will be at 9 energy, and be able to call out the Raziel a second time, because we do want it on board for Alden's effect to draw yet another card, so we can use our energy to draw 2 cards. That's amazing. On top of that, what this also means is in the early game, we have more liberties with what we call from hand, just by normal calling off of the order, or Death Fault, because we can loop them back to hand. This means that calling stuff such as PGs can be perfectly acceptable here and actually a way to loop them back. That's also why I mentioned just call out the Air Mac, because you can always loop it back this way. Everything I just covered here for your grade 3 turn going second also applies for your 4th turn going first, the turn where you can start Persona riding. So you just kind of add that on top of it. The other difference is that at that point, you will should have 5 energy. Therefore, your Raziel will only be live for 1 draw. If you're enjoying this video, please consider subscribing and turning on the notification bell so you're notified when I do upload more content just like this deck breakdown. For the Mulligan, obviously send back triggers, that's standard for pretty much any deck. But for this deck, additionally, you do not need extra copies of Persona Ride, keeping 1 usually correct. So but any extra copies, those are just dead cards in hand they'll end up discarding for Ride Line anyway, because this deck moves fast, and likely if you need Persona Ride for later, you want to draw into it, you want pieces to be able to aggress. Those best pieces, of course, are if you're going second, are grade 1, so we can start applying pressure right away. But if we're going first, which is ideal for this deck, being a aggro deck that just kind of wants to get to its big play sooner, being able to have access to Order and Death Fault is also ideal on top of the Saragon. Now, that being said, we really just need pieces to aggress with. So a lot of the times, it's a bit matchup dependent on whether or not I'll try to dig for those pieces, or just kind of keep whatever pieces I can to aggress, hoping I draw into it. Additional notes are with the Raziel, we can easily find this later. This deck has no problem digging through its deck. Its Ride Line goes through 10 cards. We've got Alden Divine Skill to help dig for stuff, way more stuff. So Raziel, I typically like to mulligan this card back because it isn't relevant until our turn 3. And if we have ways to find it, why hold on to a piece then when this could literally be any of these other pieces up here to help aggress. And PG also is matchup dependent on whether or not you keep 1 or mulligan it back. Now, as for the Ride deck discard, typically, if I have extra Persona Ride copies, as I mentioned, I axe those because this deck's trying to move fast. Ideally, I want to be winning by that first Persona Ride turn. And if not, it's still just better to literally keep anything else. And if I need more Persona Rides later, I'd rather just draw into it or just hope my aggression's been so much that even without Persona Ride, I can end the game. Raziel as well, since this deck has no problem being able to find it. Big asterisk there, depending on how many copies you find in the early game, how bad variance is screwing you over. But Raziel, typically that's also a good first discard ride because it doesn't help us aggress in the early game. And then from there, I usually just look at what I want to be able to play from my hand turn after turn versus what my opponent's doing to decide if just discard a trigger or if I need to discard a less important piece to aggress with in my hand. So for instance, if I can build a board with, say, Teth Fault and like this, the order plus one other card, maybe it's fine to discard one of my other normal units because I can still build a board. So you need to really just kind of playtest the deck and mess around with those to kind of see those lines. But the best advice I can give here is just typically think, what do I want to do? What is the least important card in my hand for this upcoming turn for me to be able to progress the way I want to, which typically is with aggression. My one additional note for this deck is you need to be very careful with your Soul Blast use in this deck. This is because we've got Tethfall here, which of course Soul Blasts. We've got the Sodios, which also Soul Blasts on ride up. We also want a Soul for Alden's Divine Skill, as well as the Raziel to start restanding. That's why the Wedge Fluence Dragon is super crucial because of its Soul Charge when it boosts. It can easily give us the Soul for the Raziel. This is mostly relevant when going second, as we get access to the Divine Skill and the Raziel a turn sooner, meaning we have less time to build up Soul through Persona riding, as well as a Wedge Fluence Dragon, as both those are timed a turn too late, or really a battle phase too late. But going first, we have more liberties with the Teth Faults as well. But definitely be thinking whether or not you need Soul for later turns, because I will say right now, making sure you've got Soul for the Divine Skill and Raziel typically takes priority over a Teth Fault. And finally, let's just go over the strengths and weaknesses of Alden. So for starters, the strengths. High level of aggression just throughout the entire course of the game. The aggression scales quite nicely as you ride up, as we discussed with the Order, and then into the Alden, and then of course once our opponent's at grade 3, we got the Raziel. Just scales quite nicely. Just hit the gas and just keep going until your opponent's dead. The second strength of this deck is the card advantage that it can gain, both through plussing to board and just card draw in general. There's a ton of cards that draw between Raziel, Order, even Alden's on attack skill. We've got ways to start filtering through the deck with Alden's Divine Skill, as well as our Teth Faults and our Saragons. And then that's just on top of what the deck already naturally does, that every Vanguard deck does. Then on top of that, kind of connected, is the deck thinning. With Teth Fault as well as Alden's Divine Skill, we're thinning out a bunch of cards from the deck, as well as the ride line. I forgot to mention the ride line. That also pluses to hand and to board as well in the form of a deck thin. So that just also condenses our deck, helping us hit triggers even more, just adding to this deck's ability to scale very well with its aggression as you ride up the grades and even get to Persona Ride. Then finally, I think a strength of the deck is the utility of Alden's first effect, being able to loop back stuff when you overcall it with Alden's effect. Just as I mentioned, gives a lot of utility. It gives us the ability to call stuff like PGs in the early game to loop back later, or even stuff like Airmac, which we want in hand to call off of Alden's skill. And on top of that, it also allows us to reuse skills such as Raziel's first skill by looping her, but also be able to take advantage of that second skill to give something that is overcalled with it, power plus 10k. I actually really like this effect. I didn't mention it in that section, but it's also like totally like another option you have is you don't have to call, say, a grade 2 over top of it to give it the 10k. You can also just overcall, say, a grade 1 over top of it, give it the 10k, move that grade 1 back, recall the Raziel, and you're good to go. So you've got a lot of flexibility there. And I really think that going forward, that this deck can really grow in power by capitalizing more on that first effect. Now, moving over to the weaknesses, variants, specifically with the early game. As I mentioned, there's some really strong early game plays, but if you don't find it, your early game definitely doesn't hit as hard or is more punishing because you're having to commit more cards from hand without reloading the hand itself. So it does mean that some games you just hit the God Hand and you can just blaze through your opponent. In other games, you don't really have your opponent where you want to be and you have to spend maybe an extra turn trying to push up that damage, which while this deck can farm up a hand to be able to survive the opponent, it does give them more opportunity to build up their game plan, build up their hand to try to stall you out, which transitions perfectly into this next weakness, deck out. This deck draws a ton, it deck thins a ton, and what that means is it just doesn't have the longevity that other decks do. So like a completely viable win condition against this deck sometimes is just to stall until they deck out, and that definitely hurts for a deck like this. And finally, the retire protection just isn't highly relevant. Even besides the fact that the top deck right now is looking to be Shoujo Doji, which does not retire, but even then, Against Varga, it's nice, but it also just doesn't provide all that much utility. And I think that's mostly because of the first skill. The most highly valuable card here is the Razianel. Yes, Airmac, but once you use the Divine skill, there's no easy way to loop it back to hand. You just need to find other copies. So it's mostly the Razianel, which you loop back to hand anyway because you're overcalling it. And then on top of that, even Razianel, I don't think is that insane of a card. Like, we don't have a super high impact, high value card in this deck that I think really capitalizes from that retire protection. So feels like a bit of wasted potential there. But kind of in conclusion of all that, I do think this deck is meta viable. There are just better options that just do a bit more, stuff a bit better, that just end up being overall better. This deck just doesn't do, I think, anything that special to make it super meta defining, but it can definitely compete, and you can definitely take it to tournament and I think still do well. But that is about all I have to say on this deck. Now I pass it on to you all in the comments section. What do you have to add about how you pilot Alden? Maybe some of your deck choices. I really want to use the comment section as a forum for you all to exchange ideas about Alden, how to play it, deck building options, you name it. So comment below what you think. And if you've enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, subscribing, and turning on the notification bell so you're notified when I do upload more content. But with all that being said though, look forward to more content coming out real soon.